The wind across the Iowa prairie that spring carried the smell of turned earth and the thin cry of a creature too small to be heard from any distance. Ruth Vale was kneeling in the mud behind the barn, her fingers raw from mending a fence that had broken again in the night, when she heard that cry and followed it to a starving kitten wedged beneath a broken cartwheel. The kitten's ribs showed through its fur like the ridges of a washboard, and its eyes were crusted shut. Ruth cupped it against her chest, feeling its heart beat fast and small against her palm, and she thought of her grandmother's voice, soft as flour sifting through a sieve. "A thing isn't worthless, child, just because nobody's found its use yet. The Lord wastes nothing. Folks only call something useless when they haven't learned to look proper." Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the tales of resilient women, ingenious underdog farmers, and homesteaders who defied mockery and hardship to build thriving legacies from nothing. This is one such story. Picture Ruth Vale there, a young woman of 25, alone on a quarter section of black Iowa soil 3 miles east of Council Bluffs. Her father had broken that soil with his own hands before the fever took him 2 winters past. Now the land belonged to Ruth and her mother, Sarah. And the neighbors had opinions about that. A young woman running a farm alone, unmarried at 25, was a curiosity at best and a scandal at worst. Ruth ignored them. She rose before the sun, mucked the stalls, milked the 2 cows, and mended whatever the wind had broken in the night. Her hands were rough and her dresses patched, but her ledger balanced, which was more than some of the married men in the county could say. The old granary stood at the edge of the yard, a squat timber building her father had meant to repair. It leaned a little now, its shingles curling, its floor scattered with the dust of harvests long spent. Ruth kept the new grain in the tight cellar beneath the house. The granary she left empty, a monument to a man's unfinished plans. Her mother, Sarah, worried in the quiet way of women who had buried too much. She watched Ruth from the kitchen window and prayed her daughter would find an easier road. "You work like you're trying to outrun something," she told her once. "Maybe I am," Ruth said, and said no more. The trouble that spring was cats. They drifted across the county like blown leaves, half-wild barn cats whose farms had failed, or whose owners had moved west and left them behind. Lean, ragged things chased off with brooms and stones from every doorstep in the settlement. Nobody wanted another mouth to feed in a year when the rains came late and the corn came up thin. Ruth's nearest neighbor was Amos Crandall, a broad, red-faced man who farmed the section to the west and never missed a chance to instruct her. He kept the biggest barn in the township and bragged that his seed corn was the finest seed for 40 miles. He also told anyone who would listen that the Vale girl would lose the farm by Christmas. "Mark me," Amos would say, leaning on his fence. "Sentiment don't fill a silo." Ruth marked him. She marked everyone. She filed away their certainties the way she filed away weather signs and seed prices, and she went on doing what her own 2 eyes told her was right. That spring, what her eyes told her began with a single, starving kitten under a broken cart. By midsummer, the kitten had become a dozen. Word spreads among the strays the way it does, and Ruth's quiet kindness drew them from miles around. She set out scraps each evening, and each evening more shadows slipped from the tall grass to eat. She named the bold ones, and let the shy ones keep their secrets. It was Amos who forced the matter. He arrived one July morning red to the ears, dragging a sack that twitched and yowled. "These are yours," he announced, dumping 9 cats onto her yard. "Found them denning in my haymow. You want to play mother to vermin, you keep them on your own ground. Next ones I find, I won't be so gentle." The cats scattered, terrified, toward the leaning granary. Ruth watched them vanish through a gap in the boards, and an idea took root in her like a seed finding water. That night, Ruth sat at the kitchen table while her mother darned socks by the lamp, and she turned the idea over and over like a stone in her palm. "I could give them the granary," she said at last. "It's standing empty. It would keep them out of everyone's barns, out of trouble." Sarah's needle paused. "Ruth, people already talk. You shelter 40 cats in your father's granary. You'll be the woman they tell stories about clear to Omaha." They already tell stories about me. Kinder ones than that would be. Sarah set down her darning. Child, I know your heart is good, but a farm is a hard ledger. Every scrap you feed those cats is a scrap that doesn't go to the hogs or to us. What do they give back? Amos isn't wrong about that part, much as it pains me to say it. Ruth had no answer ready, and that troubled her. She prided herself on reasons. She believed in the worth of the creatures in some place deeper than argument. But her mother was right that a farm did not run on feeling. She thought of all the brooms and stones, all the doors shut against those small lives for the simple crime of being unwanted. She thought of how the county measured everything by what it could sell, and she wondered if she was being foolish, a soft-hearted girl playing a charity she could not afford. But then she remembered something she had noticed and not yet understood. The corner of the barn where the cats had started sleeping. The dark corner where mice had chewed her grain sacks to ribbons every winter she could recall. That corner had gone quiet. No droppings, no gnawed holes, no skittering in the rafters at dusk. She had swept it clean a week ago, and it had stayed clean. She had not connected it until this moment. Now the connection arrived whole, the way the sun arrives over a flat horizon, all at once. They earn their keep, Mama, Ruth said slowly. I think they earn it twice over. We just never gave them a fair chance to show it. Sarah looked at her daughter for a long moment, weighing the certainty in her voice against the certainty of the whole county. It's your farm too, she said finally. If your father taught you anything, it was to trust your own eyes over other folks' mouths. But Ruth, if this goes wrong, if we come up short this winter, there'll be no one to blame but ourselves. And no one to ask for help, not after the talk. I know, Ruth said. I know it. She lay awake a long while that night, listening to the wind move through the boards of the leaning granary and the small, contented sounds within. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. In the morning, Ruth made her choice. She spent 3 days repairing the granary properly. She nailed down the curling shingles, patched the gaps in the boards, and cut a small swinging door near the foundation so the cats could come and go to hunt. She hauled in straw for bedding and set out shallow pans of water. She did not lock them in. She made it a place they would choose, and choose it they did. By the time the corn began to tassel, the granary had become a kingdom of cats. Ruth counted 47 of them, from a battle-scarred orange tom she called Captain, down to a litter of kittens still soft as milkweed. Let the county laugh, she decided. She would watch and she would learn. The first to visit was Eleanor Pratt, the new schoolteacher, who boarded in town and walked the country roads on Sundays for the air. She found Ruth in the yard with a kitten on each shoulder and, instead of laughing, crouched right down in the dust to meet them. My grandmother kept cats against the mice in her root cellar, Eleanor said. Back in Vermont, everyone there thought it sensible. She smiled up at Ruth, bright and unbothered. I can't think why it should be foolish here. It was the first kind word any neighbor had spoken about the cats. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. A friend, perhaps. The summer turned golden, and Ruth's granary became the quiet wonder of the Vale farm. Though for a long while she was the only one who wondered at it. She began in her careful way to keep account of the cats the same as she kept account of everything else. She bought a fresh ledger in town, a slim one with a green cover, and on the first page she wrote, "The Granary," in her tidy hand. Beneath it she recorded what she observed, which cats hunted the field margins and which patrolled the barn, how many mice she found laid neatly by the granary door each dawn, little tributes from creatures proving a worth nobody had asked them to prove. The dates the hawks came and the cats took shelter, the way Captain, the orange tom, organized the others without a sound, claiming the high beam and letting the kittens learn the low corners. Eleanor came most Sundays now. She brought books and brought talk, and the two young women would sit on the granary's mended step while cats wound between their ankles, and they would speak of things Ruth had no one else to speak of the wide world past the prairie, of what a person owed her own judgment, of how a town decides who belongs and who does not. You watch these animals like a scientist, Eleanor told her once, delighted, paging through the green ledger. There are men at the college in Ames who'd envy these notes. Ruth laughed it off, but the words warmed her. No one had ever called her careful thinking a virtue before. On the farm it was simply expected. Among the neighbors it was simply ignored. The neighbors, meanwhile, had a great deal to say. It began with Amos, of course. He could not pass the Vale fence without remarking on it. He took to calling the place the Cat Farm, and the name caught, the way unkind names do. At the feed store, and at the church steps, and at the Saturday market, Ruth would arrive to find conversation falling quiet, then rising again behind her, in laughter she was meant to hear. "How's the livestock, Miss Vale?" a man called out one market day, and the row of loungers by the wagons roared. "You milking them cats yet? Churning cat butter?" Ruth set her jaw and went on loading her flour. She had learned long ago that the surest way to feed a fire was to fight it. She bought what she needed, spoke politely to the merchant, and drove home with her chin level and her eyes forward. But the laughter followed her down the road, and she would be lying if she said it did not sting. It stung worse because she could not yet prove them wrong. She knew it in her bones and in her green ledger that the cats were doing something the whole county had failed to see. But knowing a thing and showing it are two different harvests, and the showing was not yet ripe. So she gathered her evidence quietly as the weeks went on. She noticed that the Vale grain cellar, which had lost 1/10 of its stores to mice every winter of her life, now showed not a single gnawed sack. She noticed the barn cats kept the corn crib clean as a swept floor. She noticed that the hawks and owls, far from competing with her cats, seemed to keep a wider berth from the whole farm, as though the dense, busy population of cats made the yard a place predators preferred to skirt. And she noticed most of all the rats, not mice, rats. The big gray Norway rats that had been spreading through the county for 3 years now, coming up the rivers and the rail lines, bolder and hungrier than any mouse. Ruth had seen them in town, fat ones slipping under the grain elevator. She had heard farmers curse them at the feed store. They could chew through a wooden bin in a night and foul 10 times what they ate. A breeding pair could become an army before the snow melted, but not at the Vale farm. The cats, 47 of them, a true colony now, hunting in shifts and learning together, held the rats at the property line like a garrison holds a wall. Ruth would find the great gray bodies at the edge of the yard some mornings, the boundary of a war the rest of the county did not yet know it was losing. She wrote it all down. She watched the corn ripen and the cats grow sleek and the laughter roll on. And she waited the way a farmer waits, trusting that some seasons reward patience and some do not. But the careful planting is always the same. Autumn came on crisp and bright, and with it the harvest. And with the harvest, the first true sign that something was wrong across the settlement. Ruth heard it first at the grist mill, where she had brought a wagon of wheat to be ground. The miller, a stooped, patient man named Hollis, weighed her grain and frowned at his own scales as though they had insulted him. "Yours is clean," he said, almost accusing, "clean as I've seen all month. You don't know how rare that's gotten, Miss Vale." "What do you mean?" Hollis leaned on the counter and lowered his voice. "Rats. Half the grain coming through here is fouled or short. The Bowman place lost 1/3 of their crib to them last week. Tunnels right up through the floor. And it's not just here," he shook his head. "Whole county's got them. Worst I've known in 30 years. They came up from the river all at once, seems like, and they're breeding faster than anybody can trap. Cats won't touch town anymore. Folks chased them all off years back. Now there's nothing to hold the line." Ruth said nothing, but her heart began to beat the way it had the night the connection first arrived whole. She paid the miller, loaded her clean flour, and drove home thinking hard the whole 3 miles. She began to pay attention beyond her own fences now. At church the next Sunday, the talk in the yard had changed its tune. No one was laughing about cats. They were murmuring about rats, about the Peterson barn where the seed corn had been found riddled with droppings, about the widow Hartley who had lost nearly her whole seed stock and did not know how she would plant in the spring, about the way the creatures seemed to grow bolder by the week, running over boots in the daylight, gnawing into bins that had held tight for 20 years. Ruth listened from the edge of the gathering where she always stood. She heard Amos Crandall holding forth in the center of it, loud as ever, but his red face had gone anxious beneath the bluster. "I've set 200 traps," he was saying, 200, and poison besides. Catch 50 a night, and there's 100 more come morning. My seed corn's behind a double wall of oak, and I still hear them working at it in the dark. He wiped his brow. Finest seed in the township, and I'm sitting up nights with a lantern like a fool. Someone asked, half joking, whether the cats might be the answer, and a few heads turned toward Ruth, but Amos snorted before she could speak. Few barn cats against this? You'd need 1,000. No, what's wanted is science, poison, and steel. I've sent to Omaha for the strongest they've got. And the talk moved on, and Ruth was left at the edge again, holding her knowledge like a coal she dared not yet show. But she did not stay silent forever. She was not made for silence when something mattered. That week she began quietly to make her case to those who would hear it. She called on the widow Hartley with a basket of eggs, and while they sat, told her plainly what she had seen, that her own granary stood untouched, that 47 cats had held a wall against the rats all season, that the answer the county had chased off with brooms might be the very thing it needed. The widow listened with the desperate attention of a woman who has lost her seed corn. "But how would a body even start?" she asked. "Cats left to be had? They've all been driven off or starved out." "I have 47, Ruth said, "and cats breed. Give me till spring and I'll have more. I can spare some now, today, if you'll house them right and feed them through the lean weeks till they learn your ground." It was a strange sight that afternoon. Ruth Vale driving home from the Hartley place with an empty crate that had carried 4 cats, and the widow Hartley standing in her doorway watching 4 lean shadows slink into her ravaged corn crib with something like hope on her tired face. It was a beginning, a small one. Ruth knew that 4 cats would not turn the tide of a county, not in a week, perhaps not in a season. The rats were too many, and the winter too close. But she had planted a seed, and she trusted seeds. What she did not yet know, what no one knew as the first hard frost silvered the prairie and the rats grew desperate with the cold, was how very much worse it was about to get, and how soon the whole settlement would come knocking at the door of the cat farm they had laughed at all year long. The first knock came on a gray November afternoon, when the prairie wind had stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods, and the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of early snow. Ruth was in the yard, spreading crushed corn for the hens, when Eleanor Pratt came riding up the lane on a borrowed horse, her face pale beneath her bonnet and her breath coming hard. She slid from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. "Ruth, the town granary, the big one by the rail depot, where they store the seed for half the township. The rats have gotten into it." Eleanor caught her breath, her hand pressed to her side. "Hollis found tunnels under the whole east wall this morning. If they breach the main bins, that's the seed corn and the winter wheat for 30 families. That's the spring planting. That's what this town eats next year." Ruth stood very still. The wind pulled at her apron strings and lifted a strand of hair across her cheek, but she did not feel it. Her mind was moving through the facts the way she had trained it to move, slowly, from the evidence outward. 30 families. The widow Hartley, who had taken 4 cats and now slept sound through the nights. The Petersons, with their 4 children and their mortgaged barn. The Bowman place, already picked clean. And Amos Crandall, who had sent to Omaha for poison that might or might not come in time. She thought of the green ledger on the shelf in the kitchen, of the 47 cats, warm and thriving, in the granary behind her, of every careful tally she had kept since July. She thought of the laughter at the market, the cat farm jokes, the way the county had measured her and found her wanting. Then she said quietly, "We'd best not waste the afternoon." She did not stop to change her dress or wash her hands. She fetched her bonnet from the peg by the door, told her mother only that she would be back before dark, and climbed into the wagon beside Eleanor. The 3 miles to town passed in a kind of charged silence, the horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm on the frozen ruts. Ruth could see the granary from half a mile off, a tall, stout building beside the rail depot, its weathered boards dark against the gray sky. It had stood for 15 years, a testament to the industry of the township, a place where farmers pooled their seed against the spring and trusted that common sense would keep it safe. Now a knot of men stood at its base, lanterns already lit though the sun had not yet set, and the look on their faces was the look of men watching a fire they cannot reach. Amos Crandall was at the center, of course, his broad red face nearly purple with effort and worry. He was directing the defenses the only way he knew how, with poison and with steel. Bait stations lined the walls, snap traps bristled in every corner. 2 men were nailing fresh oak planks over the tunneled east wall, while a third tamped broken glass into the rat runs with the handle of a shovel. It was, Ruth saw at once, exactly the wrong fight. "You're sealing them in," she said. The men turned. Amos's face darkened at the sight of her. "Miss Vale, come to offer us your cats, I expect." A few men chuckled, but the chuckles were thin and tired. They had been fighting the rats for weeks, and they were losing, and they knew it. "I've come to tell you that boarding up the wall won't help you," Ruth said, holding her voice level. "If they've already tunneled in, you're trapping a breeding colony inside the warmest, best-fed building for miles. Poison kills the ones that take it, but the smart ones learn to leave it be. You'll thin them. You won't stop them, and every day you wait, they're eating and breeding in the dark behind your good oak planks. And cats will?" Amos spread his arms to the gathered men. "You hear this? The seed for 30 families, the whole town's spring. And her answer is to turn loose a pack of half-wild barn cats inside it. They'd foul the grain worse than the rats. They'd den in the corn and have kittens in the wheat." "They wouldn't touch the grain," Ruth said. "Cats don't eat seed corn. Rats do. You'll not put your vermin in our granary." Amos's voice had gone hard. "I've sent to Omaha for the strongest poison made. It's coming on tomorrow's train. We seal the walls tonight. We lay the poison tomorrow, and we starve them out behind the oak. That's a plan, Miss Vale. That's not sentiment. That's how grown men handle a problem." Ruth looked at the faces around her. Some were closed against her, taking Amos's side out of long habit. But others, Hollis the miller, young Peterson, a few of the older farmers, were watching her with something different. They had seen the rats win for weeks. They were not as sure as Amos that more of the same would save them. "How many have your traps caught?" Ruth asked Amos directly. His jaw worked. "Hundreds." "And how many are left?" He did not answer. The silence answered for him. "My granary," Ruth said, turning now to address them all, "has held 47 cats since July. In all that time, I have not lost a single sack of grain to a single rat. Not one. You can ride out and see it yourselves, any of you, tomorrow at first light. I keep a record." She thought of the green ledger, and her voice grew steadier. "Every mouse, every rat, every week. I can show you the dates. I can show you the wall they've held all season while the rest of the county was overrun. I am not asking you to trust my feelings. I am asking you to come and look at the evidence with your own 2 eyes." For a moment, just a moment, she thought she had them. Then Amos laughed, a loud and deliberate bark that broke the spell. "Records?" "She keeps records on her cats." He shook his head as though at a child. "Go home, Miss Vale. This is men's work and serious. The poison's coming on the morning train, and we'll have this licked by the week's end. We don't need your storybook." And the moment passed. The men turned back to their oak and their glass. Ruth was left standing in the cold outside the circle of lantern light, exactly where she had always stood. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the green ledger open before her and the lamp burning low, and she made herself think the way her father had taught her, slowly, from the evidence outward, refusing to be hurried by anyone's certainty, including her own. Sealing the walls would fail, she was sure of it. The rats were already inside. The oak would only protect them. The poison might come on the morning train, or it might not. The trains ran late this time of year, and a single early snow could close the line for days. And even if it came, even if it worked as Amos promised, it would work too slowly. Every day of delay was another day the colony bred in the dark, another day closer to the bins being breached for good. She thought it through from every side, and every side came back to the same answer. The only thing that had actually held the rats all season long across a whole farm was the cats. Not because cats were magic, but because 47 of them, working together, hunting every shift of the day and night, learning the ground and patrolling it, made a place rats could not establish themselves. It was not sentiment. It was simply the way the world was built, if a person looked at it proper. But knowing it was not enough. She had known it for months, and it had changed nothing, because no one would look. Toward midnight, her mother came down in her shawl and sat across from her. "You're going to do something," Sarah said. It was not a question. "They won't listen, Mama. Amos has them sealing the rats in behind oak walls and waiting on a train that might not come. By the time the poison fails, if it comes at all, the seed could be gone. 30 families. The widow Hartley. The Petersons with their little ones." Ruth pressed her hands flat on the ledger. "I have the thing that would help them sitting in my granary, and they'd sooner starve than take help from the cat farm." Sarah was quiet a long moment. "Your father," she said at last, "used to say that being right was the easy part. The hard part was being right in a way other folks could follow." She reached across and laid her worn hand over Ruth's. "You've spent all summer proving it to yourself. Maybe it's time you stop trying to win the argument and start showing them the proof so plain that arguing's no use." Ruth looked at her mother. Something was turning over in her mind. "Show them," she repeated slowly. "They're stubborn men, child, but even a stubborn man believes his own eyes when there's nothing left to do but believe them." The words settled into Ruth's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She did not answer. She simply sat there as the lamp burned lower and her mother went back to bed, and the plan took shape in the silence. It was not a plan to win an argument. It was a plan to make the argument irrelevant. The next morning brought the worst news yet. Eleanor rode out again, and Hollis the miller came with her this time, his hat in his hands and his stooped shoulders lower than ever. "The train stopped," Hollis said heavily. "Early snow up the line near Missouri Valley. No poison coming today, maybe not for 3-4 days. And the rats," he swallowed. "They breached the first bin overnight, the east bin, the seed corn. We lost near all of it. There's 2 bins left, the wheat and the second corn. And the way they're going, they'll be through the dividing wall inside the week." He looked at Ruth with naked desperation, this man who had weighed her grain and called it clean. "Miss Vale, you said you keep records. You said your granary still holds, all season. Is it true? Is it true what you claim about the cats?" Ruth stood. She felt very calm, the calm that comes when a long-awaited season finally arrives. "Come and see," she said. She took Hollis and Eleanor out to the granary in the gray morning light, and she opened the door. 47 cats turned to look at them, sleek and well-fed and unbothered, kings of a building that had not lost a single grain all year. She opened the green ledger and laid it in the miller's hands and let the dates and the tally speak for themselves. Page after careful page, Hollis read it. He looked at the cats. He read it again. "Dear Lord," he said softly, "she's right. She's been right the whole while." But being right, Ruth discovered, was not the same as being heeded. Not yet. When Hollis carried the news and the ledger back to town, Amos would not hear it. He stood before the wounded granary with the lost seed corn behind him and his pride before him. And he refused. "1 bin's gone," he shouted, "and now she wants to turn cats loose in the last 2? Foul our final seed with the cat farm's vermin. No, we seal it. We wait on the train. We do this proper." And because he was loud, and because the men were frightened, and because frightened men reach for the loudest voice, they listened to him. They nailed their boards. They waited on a snowbound train. And in the dark, the rats kept breeding. That evening, Ruth sat alone on the mended step of her granary as the dusk came down blue and bitter, cats settling warm around her, and she felt the full weight of it press on her chest. She had been right all along. She had the proof in her own hand, the answer in her own building, and still, it was not enough. Still, the town would rather lose its seed than be saved by the woman it had laughed at. Was that to be the shape of things? That a true thing meant nothing if it came from the wrong mouth? That all her careful watching, all her patient nights with the green ledger, would amount to standing at the edge of the lantern light forever, while stubborn men sealed their doom in behind good oak? She thought of the widow Hartley, who had trusted her with 4 cats and a basket of hope. She thought of the Peterson children. She thought of a whole town going hungry through a long winter because pride was louder than proof. Captain, the old orange Tom, climbed into her lap and pressed his scarred head against her hand. She stroked him, and her eyes stung. "I don't know how to make them look," she whispered to him. "I've tried every way I know." And then, in the cold and the quiet, with the cat warm against her and the lamp glowing gold in the granary behind her, her grandmother's voice came back to her once more, soft as flour sifting. "Folks only call something useless when they haven't learned to look proper." Ruth went still. She had been trying to make them listen. Listening could be argued with. Listening could be shouted down by a louder voice. But her grandmother had not said make them listen. She had said make them look. She did not need Amos's permission. She did not need the town's vote or the churchyard's approval. She needed only to put the proof somewhere it could not be argued with. Somewhere every frightened man would see with his own 2 eyes what 47 cats could do on the very ground where the rats were winning. She stood, spilling Captain gently from her lap. "Come on," she said. "We've work to do." She did not go to bed that night. Instead, she worked. And she sent for the only allies she had. Eleanor came at once when the message reached her, and the widow Hartley came too, and Hollis the miller, who had read the ledger and could not unread it. By lantern light in the Vale yard, Ruth laid out her plan, plain and practical, the way her father would have done. "Amos won't let us put cats in the granary. Fine, we won't ask him." She drew in the frosted dirt with a stick. "The rats came up from the river along the low ground here, behind the depot. The granary sits at the end of that run. Amos has the building sealed tight as a drum, but a sealed building is exactly where the rats are trapped now, breeding with 2 bins left to eat. We can't get inside, but we don't need inside. We need to take the ground around it, the yard, the loading dock, the rail siding, the low run where they travel in the dark. We ring the whole granary and cats tonight, and we let them do at the town granary precisely what they've done all year at mine. We hold the wall from the outside." Hollis frowned. "Will they stay? Strange ground, strange place. Mine will stay where the hunting's good, and the hunting will be very good. And they'll stay where there's shelter and food I bring them, till they learn it. I've moved cats to new ground before. The widow's 4 took to it in a week. We give them straw bales and warm boxes all around the granary yard. We give them reason to call it theirs." Ruth looked up at the 3 faces in the lantern light. "It won't be magic. It won't be done by morning. But within a few nights, you'll see the rat sign at the depot fall off the way it fell off at my place. And when it does, when every man in this town can walk down and see for himself the rats dying at the granary wall while the poison sits snowbound on a stopped train, then let Amos argue with that." So they did it. Through the cold small hours, they ferried cats from the Vale granary to the town in covered crates. Not all 47, for Ruth would not strip her own farm bare. But 30 of the strongest hunters, Captain among them, the seasoned old Tom, who knew how to lead the rest on new ground. They set straw bales in a ring around the depot granary. They tucked warm boxes into the lee of the loading dock and the rail siding. They scattered the low run with the cats and let them slip into the dark to do the work they had been born to and chased away for. Then Ruth did the boldest thing of all. She did not hide what she had done. At first light, she went straight to Amos Crandall's door and told him to his face. "I've put 30 cats around the town granary," she said, "not inside, around, on the public ground by the depot and the siding. You can curse me for it if you like, but I'd ask you to do one thing first. I'd ask you to come and look every morning and count the rat sign for yourself. You're a man who trusts his own eyes, so trust them. Give it 3 days. If I'm wrong, I'll crate up every cat myself and never trouble you again. If I'm right," she held his gaze, "if I'm right, you'll help me tell this county the truth." Amos was too astonished to refuse. And because he was, at bottom, a man who believed in his own eyes more than anyone's, he came and looked. The first morning he found 9 rats dead at the granary wall, and the low run quieter than it had been in weeks. The second morning he found the rat sign halved, and Captain sunning himself atop a straw bale like a general surveying a won field, and the men who'd come to nail boards standing about with their hammers idle, watching the cats work and saying little. The third morning, he found the depot granary yard nearly silent. No skittering in the siding, no fresh tunnels in the low run. The relentless gnawing that had sounded behind the oak walls every night for weeks had faded to nothing because the colony that fed it could no longer come and go, could no longer forage the river run, could no longer breed faster than it was being hunted. The wall held. Not the wall of oak, but the living wall Ruth had set around it. On the third morning, Amos Crandall took off his hat in the cold and stood a long time looking. Then he turned and found Ruth where she stood, as always, at the edge of the gathering. But this time he did not leave her there. He walked to her across the whole length of the depot yard, in front of every man in town, and he held out his broad red hand. "I owe you an apology, Miss Vale," he said, loud enough for all of them to hear. "A man who has been wronged as publicly as I have wronged you owes a public righting of it. I called this place a folly. I called you a sentimental girl. And the plain fact is you saw clear what not one of us would look at, and you've saved the seed for 30 families doing it. The poison's still stuck on a train in the snow. Your cats are here. I was a fool, and I'm man enough to say so." Ruth took his hand. "You weren't a fool, Mr. Crandall. You just hadn't learned to look proper. None of us are born knowing how." The men opened the granary 3 days later, when the poison train finally crawled in through the melting drifts, and they found the 2 remaining bins whole, the winter wheat and the last seed corn saved entire. What had been lost was the one east bin, breached before Ruth's cats ever came. What had been saved was everything else, the spring planting for the whole township, whether half the town would eat come next year. It had been saved by 47 stray cats, and by one woman who had learned to trust her own 2 eyes over the laughter of a county. Snow fell soft and steady the following winter, a year on, and the Vale granary glowed warm against the blue dusk. But it was not the only one now. Down every lane in the township, in barn and crib and cellar, the descendants of 47 strays kept their patient watch, and the rats did not come back. Ruth stood in her yard with the green ledger under her arm and watched Eleanor's sleigh come jingling up the lane for Sunday supper, the widow Hartley waving from the seat beside her. Captain wound figure eights around Ruth's ankles, gray now about the muzzle, a king in his retirement. The county had stopped laughing long ago. They called it the cat farm still, but now, when they said it with thanks. The winter that followed the granary victory was the mildest anyone in Council Bluffs could remember, and Ruth Vale spent it in a kind of quiet contentment she had not known since before her father died. Neighbors who had once looked through her now nodded as she passed. The feed store clerk stopped making jokes about cat butter. At the Christmas service, when the preacher asked for testimonies of thankfulness, the widow Hartley stood and said, "I thank the Lord for sending us Miss Ruth Vale and her cats, for I would have no seed corn this spring without them." Ruth felt her face grow warm, and she kept her eyes on her folded hands, but the warmth spread through her chest like the first sip of coffee on a frozen morning. Captain slept on the braided rug before the hearth that winter, and Ruth would sit in the rocker her father had made, the green ledger closed on the table beside her, and feel the shape of the life she was building, not the life the county had expected of her, but the one her own eyes had led her to. Spring came early that year, with a wetness that promised good grass and strong corn. The snow melted in a rush, turning the low fields to soup and filling the creek to its banks. Ruth planted her corn in the second week of April, as her father had always done, and she felt the soil crumble through her fingers like a promise. The cats had wintered well. 47 had become 62, the new kittens bold and curious, learning the hunting grounds from their mothers. The granary had grown too small, and Ruth had built an addition against the north wall, using timber from an old chicken coop her father had never finished. The work felt good. The work felt like building something that would last. But the spring that came early also came heavy. Rain fell for 9 days straight in May, and the creek rose over its banks, flooding the low fields where the Hartley place and the Bowman place and half a dozen others had planted their earliest corn. The Petersons lost an entire field to standing water. Amos Crandall, whose land sat on higher ground, escaped the worst of it, but he spent the wet weeks pacing his porch and watching the sky with a face like thunder. Ruth's farm, thanks to the slope her father had chosen, drained well enough. She lost some seed to rot where the water pooled in the wagon ruts, but her main fields came through green and strong. She counted her blessings and waited for the sun. The sun came, finally, in the last week of May. And with the sun came the mice. Not the rats of the previous autumn, these were field mice, millions of them it seemed, driven from the flooded lowlands into the higher ground where the corn had just begun to tassel. They came in waves, pouring out of the drowned meadows and the saturated creek bottoms, seeking dry earth and tender shoots. They climbed the corn stalks and chewed the silk. They burrowed into the roots and ate the young ears from the inside out. They bred in the warm mud with a speed that turned a field brown in a matter of days. The first sign of trouble came on a Sunday morning when young Peterson rode into the churchyard with a face as white as his collar. "They've taken my bottom field," he said, his voice cracking. "Every stalk, clean as a scythe. I've never seen anything like it." By the end of that week, the mouse plague had spread across the entire township. The Bowman place, already battered by the flood, lost another third of its surviving crop. The Hartley field, the one the widow had planted with the seed corn saved by Ruth's cats, was gnawed to stubble. The men gathered at the feed store, and the talk was desperate. They set traps by the hundred. They laid poison in the field margins. They soaked rags in kerosene and hung them on stakes, hoping the smell would drive the mice away. Nothing worked. The mice kept coming, and the corn kept dying. Ruth watched from her farm with a growing unease. Her own fields were not untouched. She found the first nibbled stalk on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday she had lost a corner of the south field to the little gray bodies that swarmed through the rows like flowing water. But the damage was light compared to her neighbors. She walked the rows with Captain at her heels and saw what she saw. The cats were working, hunting day and night, keeping the mouse population from exploding on her ground the way it had on the others. She had 62 cats now, and they were hungry, and the mice were a feast. She watched a young tabby she called Whiskers take down 3 mice in the space of a single row, one after another, with the efficient ruthlessness of a creature born to the work. The problem was not that the cats could not handle the mice. The problem was that the mice had come in numbers so vast that even 62 cats could only hold a line, not push it back, and the line Ruth held was the boundary of her own farm. She went to town on a Saturday morning, hoping to buy seed to replant the damaged corner, and found the feed store crowded with grim-faced men. The talk stopped when she walked in, then resumed in a lower key. She heard the word cats twice before she reached the counter. "What are they saying?" she asked the clerk, a nervous young man named Wilkins, who had always been polite to her. He glanced at the men in the back before leaning close. "Some of them think the cats are drawing the mice, that the smell of them or the noise is pulling the varmints up from the bottoms. Mr. Crandall's been saying it." He stopped, his face reddening. "Saying what?" "Saying that your cat's done for the rats, but now they've made a different kind of trouble. That maybe nature don't like being pushed out of balance. That the mice are worse because the rats are gone, and the cats can't keep up with both." Ruth felt the words land like a slap. She had heard Amos apologize with his own mouth, had shook his hand in front of the whole depot yard. But the apology had been for the granary. The granary was one building. This was the whole county's crop, and fear was a different currency than gratitude. She paid for her seed and left without looking at the men in the back. But she heard the laughter again, thin and nervous this time, not the bold mockery of the summer before, but something more poisonous, a blame that wore the mask of reason. The next Sunday, the preacher gave a sermon about pride and the dangers of thinking oneself wiser than one's neighbors. Ruth sat in her usual pew near the back, and she felt the words land on her like stones. She did not know if the preacher meant her, but the eyes that flicked toward her during the final hymn told her enough. After the service, Amos Crandall found her on the church steps. His face was not hostile, but it was not friendly either. It was the face of a man who has been proven wrong once and is determined not to be proven wrong twice. "Miss Vale," he said, removing his hat, "I need to speak with you plainly." "Then speak plainly, Mr. Crandall." He shifted his weight. "This mouse plague is the worst I've seen since I was a boy. My fields are holding, barely, because I've been out every night with lanterns and traps. But the Petersons are going to lose their whole crop. The widow Hartley's field is gone. The Bowman place is half a ruin." "I know," Ruth said. "I've seen it. Then you've also seen that your cats haven't stopped it. They've stopped it on my farm. I've lost a corner of one field, nothing more. That's 62 cats working every hour of daylight. If the rest of you had cats, you'd be in the same shape I am." Amos's jaw tightened. "That's what I need to speak to you about. There's talk, Miss Vale. Talk that your cats have changed the balance of things. That the rats were bad, but at least they kept the mice down. Now the rats are gone, and the mice have no natural enemy but cats. And there aren't enough cats in the whole county to make a dent in a plague like this." "That's not how nature works," Ruth said, her voice steady but cold. "The rats were eating the grain, and the mice both. They weren't keeping the mice down, they were competing with them. Now the competition is gone, yes, but the cats are filling that gap. They need time to breed up to the population. A season, maybe 2. In the meantime, you have to give them room to work." "We don't have 2 seasons, Amos said. "We have this season. If the corn fails, there's no seed for next spring. No food for the winter. The bank will take half the farms in this township before the snow flies." He looked at her with something that might have been pleading. "I'm not saying you meant harm. I'm saying the harm is done, and we need to stop it before it gets worse." "What do you want me to do?" "Thin the cats. Take some of them off the land. Let the mice and the rats find a new balance, the way they had before." Ruth stared at him. "You want me to kill my cats?" "I want you to stop making the problem worse." "The problem," Ruth said, her voice rising for the first time, "is that you'd rather blame a woman and her vermin than admit that the only thing that saved your seed corn in November is the same thing that's holding the line on my farm right now. The cats are not the problem, Mr. Crandall. The problem is that you won't look." She turned and walked away, leaving him on the church steps with his hat in his hands. That afternoon, Eleanor came out to the farm, her face troubled. "There's a meeting tonight at the town hall," she said. "Amos called it. They're going to vote on whether to demand you remove the cats from the county, or at least from within a mile of any cultivated field." Ruth sat down hard on the granary step. Captain came and pressed against her leg. "They can't do that," she said. "These are my animals. They're on my land. They can make it impossible for you to keep them. They can refuse to sell you grain, refuse to grind your wheat, refuse to trade with you at all. Amos has the feed store and the grist mill behind him now. Hollis is on your side, but he's only one man." Ruth looked out at her fields, green and tall, and then at the cats, scattered through the yard and the barn, unaware that their lives were being weighed on a town hall scale. "I won't do it," she said. "I won't thin them. I won't move them. I won't apologize for being right." Eleanor knelt beside her. "Then you need to come to the meeting. You need to make them see." Ruth shook her head. "They don't want to see. They want someone to blame. It's easier to blame the woman with the cats than to admit they don't understand what's happening." "Then make them understand," Eleanor said. "You have the ledger. You have the evidence. You have the truth. The truth didn't matter in November. It only mattered after the rats were dying at the granary wall. Then show them the same thing again. Let them see the mice dying on your fields. Invite them to walk your rows and count." Ruth was silent for a long moment. The wind moved through the tall grass, and the cats moved through the shadows, and the weight of the whole county pressed on her shoulders like a yoke. "All right," she said at last. "I'll come, but I won't beg. I'll lay out the evidence, and if they choose to ignore it again, that's on them. I won't set fire to myself to keep them warm." The town hall was packed that night. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting long shadows across the faces of farmers and their wives, merchants and laborers, every soul who had a stake in the spring planting. Amos Crandall stood at the front, his broad hands resting on the edge of a table covered in maps and ledgers. The mood was restless, angry. Ruth took a seat near the middle, with Eleanor on one side and the widow Hartley on the other. She did not miss the way several people shifted away from her, as if she carried something contagious. Amos called the meeting to order. He spoke for 10 minutes about the mouse plague, about the flooded fields, about the hard choices that lay ahead. He did not mention Ruth by name, but everyone knew. Then he opened the floor to discussion, and the floodgates broke. Young Peterson stood and said his bottom field was gone, and that he had seen more cats on the road near Ruth's farm than anywhere else. A man named Griffin, who farmed the section south of the Vale place, stood and claimed that his mice problem had gotten worse since the cats moved in. "They're attracting them," he said, "drawing them like a magnet. We need to break the cycle." Ruth listened as the accusations built, each one more confident than the last. She did not interrupt. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and the green ledger tucked under her arm, and she waited. When the last speaker had sat down and the room had fallen into a murmuring lull, Amos turned to her. "Miss Vale, do you have anything to say?" Ruth stood. She walked to the front of the hall, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. She laid the green ledger on the table and opened it to a page she had marked with a strip of cloth. "This is my record," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I started it in July of last year. I have recorded every mouse and every rat found on my property, every cat added to the colony, every field checked, every grain bin inspected. It is not a story. It is a count." She read aloud the totals, the mice kills per week, the rise in the fall when the rats first appeared, the decline after the cats established their territory, the steady, low number through the winter, the spike in the past 2 weeks. A spike, but one far smaller than any farm in the township. "My south field has lost less than 5% of its crop," she said. "I walked it this morning. The cats are working the rows day and night. The mice are not winning on my land. They are not winning because 62 cats are patrolling every inch of it." She looked out at the faces, some hostile, some uncertain, a few, very few, nodding. "I am not here to tell you that the cats are a perfect solution. They are not. They cannot stop a plague of this size alone. But they are the only solution that is working anywhere in this township. Your traps and your poison have failed. My cats have not. You can vote to drive them out. You can blame me for the flood and the rain and the mice that came with them. But when the corn fails and the bank comes calling, do not say you were not shown the way." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Amos stood again. "She makes a fair point," he said slowly, "about her own land. But one farm does not make a county. Her cats may hold her fields. They are not holding mine." He looked at Ruth with an expression she could not read, not anger, not apology, but something between. "I need to see it, Miss Vale. I need to walk your fields and count the mice for myself. If what you say is true, then I will stand with you in front of this town and say so. But if it is not—" He let the rest hang. Ruth met his eyes. "Come tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll show you every row, every tally, every cat. And when you've seen it, Mr. Crandall, I expect you to keep your word." The meeting dissolved in murmurs and the scraping of chairs. Ruth gathered her ledger and walked out into the cool night air, Eleanor and the widow Hartley flanking her. The stars were bright overhead, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth and growing things. She did not know if Amos would see what she saw. She did not know if seeing would be enough, but she had planted her seed, and she would trust it to grow, or not, as the ground allowed. She did not sleep that night. She walked her fields by moonlight, Captain at her heels, and counted the mice she found dead in the furrows. The number was small, smaller than she had hoped, but larger than she had feared. The cats were working, but the plague was larger than any one farm could contain. She thought of the depth of the prairie, the miles of flooded bottomland where the mice bred unchecked. She thought of the months ahead, the long summer of eating and breeding, the autumn harvest that would decide the fate of every family in the township. She thought of the edge of the lantern light where she had always stood, and wondered if she would ever be allowed to step fully into the warmth. Captain rubbed against her ankle and purred, a low, steady sound like a wheel turning. She knelt and stroked his scarred head. "We'll keep fighting," she whispered. "That's all we know how to do." In the dark, a dozen cats emerged from the corn rows, their eyes glowing green in the starlight, and formed a silent circle around her. She felt for a moment not alone. Amos Crandall arrived at the Vale farm the next morning before the dew had dried on the grass. He came alone, without his usual retinue of nodding men or the loud certainty that had carried him through every argument the year before. He wore his work clothes and his old hat, and he carried nothing in his hands but the willingness to look. Ruth met him at the gate, the green ledger under her arm and Captain twining around her ankles. She did not offer him coffee or a seat. She simply said, "Follow me," and led him into the south field. The corn stood waist-high, green and strong, the tassels beginning to show. The morning light slanted through the rows, casting long shadows, and the air was thick with the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves. Ruth stopped at the edge of the damaged corner, where a patch of about a quarter acre had been gnawed to stubble. The stalks lay broken, the young ears chewed to nothing. It was a wound in the green, clean and unmistakable. "Here," she said, "is where they got in. I found it 4 days ago." The cats had it contained by the next morning, and the damage has not spread. Amos knelt, turning over a broken stalk in his hands. He examined the gnaw marks, the dried sap where the mouse teeth had cut through. He said nothing, but his jaw worked as he stood and followed her deeper into the field. Ruth walked him row by row, stopping at every 10th row to let him see the healthy stalks, the unchewed ears, the absence of the skittering and rustling that marked a field under siege. She pointed out the cat sign, paw prints in the soft soil, droppings along the furrows. A fresh killed mouse laid neatly at the base of a stalk like an offering. "They hunt in shifts," she said. "The older cats take the night, when the mice are most active. The younger ones work the day, learning the ground. They rotate the territory, so no part of the field goes unwatched for more than an hour." Amos listened. He did not argue. He walked the entire field, nearly 8 acres, without complaint. At the end, he stood at the edge of the north meadow, where the long grass met the corn, and he looked back at the green rows stretching away. "How many cats are on this field right now?" he asked. "A dozen at least. The rest are on the other fields, the barn, the granary. They spread out according to need. I don't direct them. They know." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me the ledger." Ruth took him to the kitchen table, where she had laid out the ledger open to the latest pages. He sat down heavily, pulled the lamp closer, and read for a full quarter of an hour, turning pages slowly, tracing his finger down the columns of dates and numbers. His face, rough and red and usually certain, was still and thoughtful. When he finished, he closed the book and set it on the table with a care that surprised her. "You have been thorough," he said. "I can't argue with these numbers. They're plain." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that was not pride or skepticism, but simple confusion. "I don't understand it, Miss Vale. I've been farming for 30 years, and I've never seen a colony of cats work like this. They've always been useful for a barn or a house, but this—" He gestured toward the window, toward the green fields beyond. "This is different. This is like they're organized. Like they know what they're doing." "They do," Ruth said. "They learn from each other. The older ones teach the younger ones. They share territory. They pass on knowledge of the ground. It's not magic, Mr. Crandall. It's just that no one ever watched them long enough to see it." He nodded slowly, as if tasting the idea and finding it strange but not impossible. "I'll speak at the next meeting," he said. "I'll tell them what I've seen." But the mouse plague had not waited for meetings. While Amos was walking Ruth's fields, the mice had pushed deeper into the township. The reports came in over the next week like a drumbeat of bad news. The Griffin place lost another field. The Peterson barn was overrun. The Bowman house found mice in the pantry and the flour barrel and the children's beds. Desperation turned to panic, and panic turned to blame. The town held a second meeting, and this time the mood was uglier. Amos stood and delivered what he had promised. A full account of what he had seen at the Vale farm. The fields holding, the cats working, the ledger clean. But the crowd did not want to hear it. They wanted action, not explanation. They wanted someone to pay for the ruin spreading across their land. A man named Granger, whose farm lay north of town and who had lost nearly everything to the flood and the mice both, stood and pointed at Ruth. "She's been coddling those creatures all year, and now they've drawn the plague to our doorsteps. It's her fault. If she'd done what sensible folks do and kept her barn clean and her cats few, we wouldn't be in this mess." The room erupted in shouts. Ruth sat still, her hands folded, her face a mask. She had known this was coming. She had known that gratitude was a shallow well, and that fear ran deeper. Eleanor stood and tried to speak, but the noise drowned her out. The widow Hartley stood and tried to tell her story, how the 4 cats had saved her corn crib. But someone shouted that the widow was just a soft old woman who didn't know any better. The meeting was spiraling into chaos when a new voice cut through the noise. It was Hollis the miller, who had not spoken at the first meeting. He stood at the back of the hall, his stooped shoulders straight for once, and he bellowed, "Enough!" The room fell silent, startled. Hollis walked to the front, his boots heavy on the boards. He looked at the crowd, then at Ruth. "I have a mill to run," he said. "I grind the grain that comes through. I see whose grain is clean and whose is fouled. I saw it in the autumn, when the rats were at the granary, and I see it now." He held up a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Miss Vale's grain has been the cleanest in this township for a year. Every sack she brings me is free of droppings and gnaw holes. I cannot say the same for the rest of you." He turned to face the crowd. "You want to blame her for the mice? Then show me the evidence. Show me that her cats are drawing them, not killing them. I've walked her fields with my own eyes. The mice are dying there, not breeding. If you want to drive out the only thing that's working, you go ahead. But don't come crying to me when your grain is so full of mouse dirt that I can't grind it." The room was divided. Some of the men looked down, shamed. Others shifted restlessly, unconvinced. Amos stood again and raised his voice. "We will not drive out Miss Vale or her cats. That is not the way of this township. We are neighbors, not enemies." He looked at Ruth and his voice softened. "But we need help. The plague is too big for one farm. Miss Vale, can you spare more cats? Can you lend them out, the way you did for the widow Hartley?" Ruth considered. She had 62 cats, and the kittens were growing fast. She could spare perhaps a dozen, if she was careful. But the mice were everywhere, and a dozen cats would be a drop in a very large bucket. "I can spare some," she said, "but they need to be placed properly. They need shelter and food and time to learn the ground. If you dump them in a field and expect them to work overnight, they'll leave." Amos nodded. "Then we do it proper. We set up shelters. We feed them till they settle. We give them the time you say they need." The meeting ended with a grudging compromise. Ruth would provide 15 cats to be distributed among the hardest-hit farms, and the farmers would build proper shelters and provide feed for the first month. It was not a victory. It was a truce, fragile and uneasy. The next morning, Ruth selected the 15 cats carefully. She chose the strongest hunters, the ones who had shown the most initiative in learning new ground. She kept Captain and the core of the colony, knowing they were the backbone of her own defense. She packed the 15 in crates and rode with Eleanor to deliver them. The first stop was the Griffin place. Griffin met them at the gate with a face like stone. He did not thank her. He simply pointed to a tumble-down shed and said, "Put them in there." Ruth looked at the shed. The roof was half gone. The floor was mud. There was no straw, no water, no shelter from the wind. "They need better than this," she said. Griffin shrugged. "They're cats. They'll manage." Ruth felt a cold anger rise in her chest, but she held it. She unloaded 2 cats, a gray female with a torn ear and a young tabby, and set them down in the yard. They looked around, smelled the ground, and immediately began to move toward the cornfield. They would work, she knew. They would hunt and kill and hold the line, because that was what they did. But they would not stay. Not in a place with no shelter, no food, no welcome. She told Griffin as much, but he waved her off. "If they leave, he said. "I didn't ask for this." The next stop was the Peterson place. Young Peterson was more grateful. He had built a shelter, a low lean-to against the barn, filled with straw and a pan of water. He had even put out a bowl of milk, which the cats ignored. Ruth set down 3 cats and watched them vanish into the lean-to. "They'll need a few days to learn the ground," she said. "Don't expect results overnight, but by the end of the week you should see the mouse sign drop." Peterson nodded. He looked tired, younger than his years, with the weight of a failing farm on his shoulders. "Thank you, Miss Vale, I mean it." Ruth nodded and moved on. She spent the whole day driving from farm to farm, placing cats, giving instructions, answering questions. By sunset, she had delivered all 15, and her wagon was empty. She drove home in the gathering dusk, the wind cold against her face, and she felt the weight of the day in her bones. She had done what she could. She had spread the cats across the township, seeded the ground with the only solution she knew. Whether the farmers would give them the time and the shelter they needed, she could not control. That night, she sat on the granary step and counted the cats that remained. 47. The core of the colony was intact. Captain came and sat beside her, his warm weight against her leg. "We'll hold our ground," she told him. "Whatever happens, we'll hold." But holding was not enough. The mouse plague grew worse. The 15 cats she had placed began to drift back over the following weeks. 2 from the Peterson place stayed, but the others returned one by one, thin and tired, having found no shelter, no steady food, no reason to remain on farms that treated them as tools rather than allies. Griffin's cats left within 3 days. The Bowman cats lasted a week. By the end of the month, Ruth had 58 cats again, and the township was no better off than before. The farmers who had received cats accused Ruth of sending them weak or unwilling animals. The old laughter returned, sharper now, edged with bitterness. "Her cats are only good for her own land," they said. "They're like her. They won't lift a paw for anyone else." Ruth bore it in silence. She did not explain that the cats had returned because they had not been welcomed, that a creature cannot work for a master who despises it. She did not defend herself. She simply kept her own fields green and her own cats fed, and let the anger of the township wash over her like rain. But the loneliness of it pressed on her chest, heavy as a millstone. She began to wonder if she was wrong after all. Not about the cats, she knew they worked, but about the possibility of convincing others. Perhaps some truths could only be learned by suffering. Perhaps the county had to hit bottom before it would look up. The bottom came in the 3rd week of June. The mice had spread beyond the fields into the town itself. They invaded the feed store, the grist mill, the church. They chewed through the wiring of the grain elevator, causing a short that nearly started a fire. They got into the well at the schoolhouse, and the children were sent home for 3 days while the town council figured out how to clean it. The morning the school closed, Eleanor rode out to the Vale farm with a face as gray as ash. "They're talking about burning the granary," she said. "The town granary. They think if they destroy the stored grain, the mice will have nothing to eat and will move on." Ruth stared at her. "That's the seed corn. That's next year's planting. They'd burn their own future?" "They're desperate, Ruth. Desperate people do desperate things." Ruth stood up. She felt the anger rise again, but this time it was different. Not cold, but hot, burning through the weariness like a flame through dry grass. "No," she said, "they will not burn that granary. I will not let them." She took the green ledger and the last of her hope and rode into town. The ride into town was a blur of dust and desperation. Ruth did not slow the horse until she reached the depot yard, where a crowd had gathered before the town granary. The building stood dark and silent, its oak walls still bearing the scars of the autumn rat war. But now the threat came from within. 20 or 30 men stood in a loose circle around the base, lanterns casting long shadows, and in the center of the circle lay a pile of kindling and kerosene-soaked rags. Amos Crandall stood apart from them, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When he saw Ruth climb down from the wagon, he walked toward her, his boots heavy on the packed earth. "Miss Vale, you should not be here." "I heard you were going to burn the seed corn," she said, her voice flat. "I had to see it with my own eyes." He did not deny it. "The town council voted this morning, 9-4. The mice have gotten into the remaining bins, the ones we saved from the rats. They've chewed through the dividers. The whole granary is infested. We cannot clean it. We cannot poison it fast enough. The only way to stop them from spreading to every farm in the county is to burn it all and start fresh." He looked at the building, and his voice dropped. "It is the hardest thing I have ever voted for." Ruth looked past him at the men, some of whom she recognized from the church meetings and the feed store. They stood with their arms crossed or their hands in their pockets, their faces set in grim resolve. They were not angry at her, not tonight. They were simply defeated. "Burn the granary, and you burn the spring planting," she said. "You burn the seed for 30 families. You burn next year's food. You might as well burn the whole town. We know, Amos said, his voice weary, but we have no other choice. You do, Ruth said. You have the cats. Amos looked at her, and for a moment she saw something like hope flicker in his eyes, then die. We tried that, Miss Vale. Your cats came and went. They did not stay. The men did not shelter them properly, I know that. But we cannot force the cats to stay where they do not want to be. They did not stay, Ruth said, because you did not welcome them. You treated them like tools, not partners. You gave them broken sheds and no food and expected them to work miracles overnight. That is not how it works. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Amos could hear. I will bring my cats, all of them, not 15, every single one. I will set up proper shelter here, in the depot yard. I will feed them and bed them and give them time to learn this ground. I will sleep here myself if I have to. Give me 3 days. If I cannot show you that the mice can be beaten back from this granary, I will not say another word. You can light the fire. Amos studied her for a long time. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of kerosene from the pile of kindling. He looked at the granary, then at the men, then back at Ruth. You would bring every cat you have? Risk losing them all? They are not mine to lose, Ruth said. They are their own. They choose to stay with me because I respect them. I will ask them to choose this ground for 3 days, and I believe they will. Amos took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. Then he turned to face the crowd. Men, he called out, Miss Vale has a proposal. He repeated what Ruth had said, and the crowd stirred. Some shook their heads, some muttered. But one of the older farmers, a man named Hargrove who had not spoken at the earlier meetings, stepped forward. I have seen her fields, he said. I rode past last week, green as spring, while mine was brown. I give her the 3 days. Another man echoed him, then another. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. Amos turned to Ruth. 3 days, he said, starting tomorrow at dawn. Ruth drove home through the dark, her mind already planning. She would need straw, a dozen bales at least, for bedding. She would need pans for water and scraps for food, table scraps, milk, whatever she could spare. She would need to bring the cats in crates, but the crates would only hold a few at a time. She would need to make multiple trips, or find a way to move them in a group. She thought of Captain, who had led the cats across the county once before to the granary in the autumn. If she put him in the lead, the others might follow. It was a risk, but the only one she had. At the farm, her mother met her at the door, her face anxious. Eleanor sent word. They are going to burn the granary? Not yet, Ruth said. I bought 3 days. She explained her plan, and Sarah listened in silence. When Ruth finished, her mother said, You will need help. I have Eleanor. I have the widow Hartley. You will need more than that. Sarah reached for her shawl. I am coming with you. Dawn came gray and cold, a thin mist hanging over the prairie. Ruth loaded the wagon with straw bales and crates and pans, and she and her mother drove to the Vale granary to gather the cats. It was a slow, careful process. Captain came first, leaping into the wagon bed as if he understood the mission. The others followed, some jumping in on their own, others needing to be coaxed. Ruth counted as they came. 47, the core colony, plus the returned ones, for a total of 58. She tied a tarp over the wagon to provide some shelter, and they set out for town, the cats riding in a cluster of fur and warmth, their eyes glowing from the shadows beneath the canvas. At the depot yard, the men had already gathered, watching in silence as Ruth and her mother set up the camp. They built a low enclosure against the north wall of the granary, using bales of straw to form a windbreak. They laid down fresh straw for bedding and set out shallow pans of water. Ruth opened the crates one by one, and the cats emerged, cautious at first, then curious. Captain jumped down first, walked a slow circle around the yard, then settled on the highest straw bale, his tail curling around his paws. The others followed his lead, spreading out to explore the new territory. Within an hour, the 58 cats had made the depot yard their own. The first day was slow. The cats spent the morning exploring, marking their territory, and sleeping. By afternoon they began to hunt, but only in the margins, the edges of the yard, the rail siding, the low run. The men who had gathered to watch grew restless. "They are not doing anything," one muttered. "They are just sleeping." Ruth said nothing. She knew the cats were learning the ground, mapping the scent trails, identifying the best hunting spots. They would work in their own time. By evening, the pile of dead mice at the granary door numbered 7. It was not much, but it was a start. Amos came by as the sun set, looking at the small pile, and said nothing. The second day began differently. Ruth arrived at dawn to find a dozen mice laid neatly in a row at the granary door, arranged by size, as if the cats had been keeping their own tally. Captain sat on his straw bale, grooming his paw, looking like a general reviewing his troops. The hunting picked up through the day. The cats spread deeper into the yard, then into the granary itself through the gaps in the boards. Ruth watched them work, their movements fluid and efficient, each cat claiming a small territory and patrolling it tirelessly. By the end of the second day, the pile of dead mice had grown to 43. The men who were watching had stopped muttering. They were counting. But the third day brought trouble. Ruth arrived at dawn to find the sky dark with clouds and the wind carrying the smell of rain. A storm was coming, a big one, rolling in from the west. If it hit, the cats would need shelter. Their straw bale windbreak would not hold against a prairie storm. And if the cats scattered, the progress of 2 days would be lost. Amos met her at the granary door, his face troubled. "The storm will be here by midday," he said. "We might have to call it off. If the cats leave, we will be back where we started." Ruth looked at the sky. The clouds were low and black, moving fast. She looked at the cats, who had gathered in a tight cluster by the granary wall, their fur ruffled by the rising wind. Captain sat apart, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could read the weather in his bones. "They will not leave," Ruth said. "They are settled now, but they need better shelter." Amos hesitated, then made a decision. "We will open the granary, just the outer door. They can take shelter inside, near the entrance. We will not let them into the main bins." "But the mice are in there already. Maybe they can do some good." Ruth looked at him, surprised. This was the same man who had called her cats vermin a year ago. He held her gaze. "I have seen what they can do," he said. "I trust them." They opened the heavy oak door of the granary, just a crack, just enough for the cats to slip through. Captain was the first to enter, his nose twitching, his tail high. The others followed, a silent stream of fur and purpose, vanishing into the dim interior. Ruth and Amos stood at the door, watching. The storm broke an hour later, a driving rain that turned the yard to mud and flattened the straw bales. But the cats were safe inside the granary, warm and dry, and they did not stop hunting. Throughout the storm, Ruth could hear the occasional squeak and scuffle from inside, the sound of a colony at war with an infestation. She and Amos took shelter in the depot, watching the rain pour down. "If this works," Amos said, "I do not know how I will ever repay you." "I do not want repayment," Ruth said. "I want this town to learn to look." He nodded, and they waited out the storm in silence. The rain stopped at dusk, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky of deep violet and gold. The yard was a mess of puddles and bent straw, but the granary stood solid, its oak walls wet and gleaming in the fading light. Ruth and Amos walked to the door and opened it. The cats were waiting for them, arranged in a semicircle near the entrance, their eyes reflecting the last light. Before them, laid out in neat rows, were the bodies of rats and mice. Not dozens, but hundreds. The floor was covered. The pile stretched from the door to the first bin, a testament to 3 days of hunting. Captain sat at the center of the arrangement, his orange fur dark with rain and blood, his eyes calm and steady. Amos stared. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Dear Lord," he whispered, "how many?" Ruth knelt and began to count, but the number was beyond a quick tally. "More than 200, she said. "Maybe 3. They have been working through the storm." She looked at the cats, who watched her with patient attention, and she felt a swell of gratitude so deep it nearly brought her to tears. "They have done it. The granary is clean." Amos turned and walked out into the yard. The men who had come to watch the third day's verdict were gathered under the depot awning, their faces anxious. Amos raised his voice. The granary is clean. The cats have cleared it. Every rat, every mouse, dead on the floor. The seed corn is safe. A murmur ran through the crowd, then a cheer. But Ruth, standing at the granary door, did not cheer. She looked at Captain, who had not moved from his place, and she saw that he was limping. One paw was held off the ground, dark with something that might have been blood. She knelt and examined it. A deep gash, perhaps from a rat's bite, perhaps from a shard of broken glass buried in the straw. She lifted him gently, cradling his warm body against her chest, and carried him to the wagon. The crowd was still cheering when she drove away into the dusk, her cat held close, her heart heavy with a victory she had not expected to cost so much. Ruth carried Captain into the kitchen and laid him on the table, where the lamplight fell full upon his wounded paw. The gash ran deep across the pad, dark with blood and dirt, and as Ruth examined it, she felt the old Tom tremble beneath her hands. He did not cry out. He simply looked at her with his yellow eyes, patient and trusting, as if he knew she would do what needed to be done. Sarah came with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, and together they cleaned the wound. Ruth had stitched 100 cuts on livestock and mended 1,000 tears in harness leather, but her hands shook as she threaded the needle. Captain lay still, his breathing steady, and when the first stitch went through his skin, he flinched but made no sound. Ruth worked quickly, her jaw set, her eyes focused. 7 stitches closed the gash, and she wrapped the paw in a strip of clean linen. Then she lifted him to the braided rug before the hearth, where he curled into a tight orange ball and closed his eyes. Ruth sat beside him through the night, her hand resting on his side, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. She did not sleep. The sun rose clear and cold, washing the kitchen in pale light. Captain stirred, lifted his head, and licked at the bandage once before settling again. Ruth felt a knot loosen in her chest. He would live. The wound would heal, and he would walk again, though perhaps with a limp that would remind her of this season for the rest of his days. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound of wagon wheels in the yard. She rose and went to the door, expecting her mother or Eleanor. Instead, she found the yard full of people. Amos Crandall stood at the front, his hat in his hands. Behind him stood Hollis the miller, young Peterson, the widow Hartley, Eleanor, and a dozen others, farmers and wives, the feed store clerk, the preacher, even old Granger who had blamed her at the town meeting. They stood in a loose semicircle, their faces solemn, their hands empty. Ruth stepped out onto the porch. "Mr. Crandall," she said, "what is this?" Amos cleared his throat. "Miss Vale, we have come to apologize, all of us." He looked at the ground, then back at her. "I have been wrong about you, about your cats, about everything from the beginning. I called you a sentimental girl. I called your cats vermin. I tried to keep them out of the granary, and I nearly burned the seed corn because I would not listen." He took a step forward. "You saved this township 3 times. Once from the rats, once from the mice, and once from our own foolishness. I cannot repay that, but I can ask your forgiveness, and I can promise you that from this day forward, no one in this county will speak ill of you or your cats in my hearing." He held out his hand. Ruth looked at it for a long moment. She thought of the laughter at the market, the cold shoulder at church, the meeting where they had voted to blame her. She thought of Captain on the braided rug, his paw stitched and wrapped, the price of a victory that should never have been a fight. Then she thought of the granary door opening, the cats streaming in, the pile of dead mice at dawn. She thought of the widow Hartley's hope, and the Peterson children, and the spring planting saved. She took Amos's hand. "I forgive you, Mr. Crandall, but I ask one thing in return. Anything. Build a proper shelter for the cats at the town granary. Not a lean-to, a real building, with straw and water and a door they can open themselves. Let them be part of this town, not outcast, and let me teach others how to work with them, so that when the next plague comes, and it will come, this county will know what to do." Amos nodded. "We will build it with our own hands, and we will name it the Vale Granary Cat Station, if you will allow it." Ruth felt a warmth spread through her, the first true warmth she had felt in weeks. "I would be honored," she said. They built it in the first week of July, when the corn stood tall and the mice had retreated to the lowlands. Every man in the township contributed something: lumber, nails, labor, a day's work. Amos Crandall framed the door himself, setting the posts deep in the ground. The structure was simple but sturdy, a long shed against the north wall of the granary, with a row of small swinging doors along the base so the cats could come and go as they pleased. Inside, they built shelves and platforms, laid deep straw, and set out pans of fresh water every morning. The widow Hartley donated a quilt, patched and clean, for the cats to sleep on. The Petersons brought a bowl of milk each evening. On the day the shelter was finished, Ruth brought Captain to see it. He walked through the small door, his limp still visible but improving, and he sniffed every corner, every shelf, every straw bale. Then he climbed to the highest platform, turned around twice, and lay down with his tail curled over his nose. It was the first time Ruth had seen him fully relax since the storm. The cats took to the shelter as if they had always belonged there. Within a week, the colony had re-established itself, hunting the town granary and the depot yard and the rail siding. The mouse sign dropped to nothing. The seed corn sat undisturbed in its bins, and the town began to change. It happened slowly, the way a field changes from brown to green. First, the children began to visit the cat shelter after school, bringing scraps and sitting quietly to watch the kittens play. Then the women started coming, sitting on the bench Ruth had placed near the door, mending or knitting while the cats wound around their ankles. Then the men, the same men who had laughed at the cat farm, started stopping by in the evenings, leaning against the shelter wall, smoking their pipes and talking about the weather. They began to notice things they had never noticed before. The way the cats organized themselves, the way they taught their young to hunt, the way they knew which fields needed patrolling and which could rest. They began to understand that what Ruth had done was not luck or sentiment, but a kind of wisdom they had been too proud to see. Amos Crandall became the most vocal convert. He told the story at the county fair, standing on a crate by the livestock barn, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I laughed at a woman who knew more than I did," he said. "I called her foolish because I could not understand her. And she saved my farm, my seed corn, and my pride, though the last took the longest to accept." The crowd laughed, but it was a kind laugh, and when Amos pointed to Ruth where she stood at the edge of the gathering, they clapped. Ruth did not step into the center. She was not built for centers, but she nodded, and she smiled, and she felt the warmth of belonging settle around her like a shawl. Autumn came golden and abundant that year. The harvest was the best the township had seen in a decade, full bins and full bellies, and when the first snow fell, it fell on a county that had learned to look. Ruth stood at the window of her kitchen on a December evening, watching the snow drift past the lamplight. The green ledger lay open on the table, filled now with 3 seasons of records. She had started a new page that morning, headed simply, "The Town Shelter." Beneath it, she had written the names of the cats who had taken up residence there. 23 so far, each one a descendant of the original 47. Captain lay on the braided rug before the hearth, his bandage long gone, his paw healed but stiff. He was grayer now, slower, but he still made his rounds each morning, limping through the granary and the barn, checking on his kingdom. Ruth knelt beside him and stroked his scarred head. He purred, a low, rumbling sound like a faraway storm, and pressed his forehead against her hand. "We did it, old friend," she whispered. "We showed them." He blinked his yellow eyes, slow and content, and Ruth felt a tear slide down her cheek. The final recognition came on Christmas Eve, when the church held its annual service, and the preacher asked for testimonies. Amos Crandall rose from his pew and walked to the front. He turned to face the congregation, and he looked directly at Ruth. "I have said my piece before," he said, his voice rough, "but I have one more thing to say tonight. We have a tradition in this church of giving thanks for the blessings of the year. I have never stood up here before. I was always too proud, or too stubborn, or too sure that I had earned what I had. But this year I learned something I should have learned 40 years ago." He paused, and the room was silent. "I learned that the Lord does not send wisdom only to those who have been farming the longest, or who talk the loudest, or who have the most land. Sometimes he sends it in the form of a quiet woman who trusts her own eyes, and a colony of cats that everyone else had given up on." He looked at Ruth, and his voice cracked. Miss Ruth Vale, I am grateful. We all are. And I am sorry, truly sorry, that it took a plague and a burned seed bin for me to see what was in front of me all along." The congregation rose to their feet, and the applause was long and warm. Ruth sat in her pew, her hands folded, her cheeks wet. Captain was not there, he was at home, asleep on the rug, but she felt him beside her all the same. She walked home that night through the snow, the stars sharp and bright overhead, the whole world white and still. The Vale farmhouse glowed golden in the dark, and when she opened the door, Captain lifted his head from the rug and thumped his tail once in greeting. She hung her bonnet, closed the door against the cold, and sat down in the rocker by the fire. The green ledger sat on the table, closed now, its work complete for the season. She picked it up and ran her hand over the cover, feeling the weight of the numbers and the dates and the quiet proof of a year's worth of watching. She thought of her grandmother's voice, soft as flour sifting. Folks only call something useless when they haven't learned to look proper. She had learned to look. And she had taught the county, not through arguments or pleas, but through the simple, stubborn evidence of what was true. Captain climbed into her lap, slow and careful, and settled against her. His purr rose through the quiet room, steady and warm. Ruth closed her eyes and let the sound fill her, a lullaby of a year's hard work and a battle won. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.